Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for the first rulemaking workshop for House Bill 1543. So today's main topic on rulemaking is on the proposed rules for extensions and exemptions for the Clean Buildings Performance Standard. I'm Annalyn Bergen, the Clean Buildings Compliance Lead and part of the rulemaking staff. The other presenters include Luke Howard and Jeff Rasmussen. This slide represents our agency's purpose. If you're unfamiliar with Commerce, we offer a broad range of programs and services. Commerce touches every aspect of community and economic development. Commerce has over 400 grants and programs. We work with local governments, tribes, businesses, and civic leaders throughout the state to strengthen communities so all residents may thrive and prosper. So here's today's agenda. I'll give an introduction of the rulemaking process, the flow and timeline. Luke will go over our intentions again, the scope of our rulemaking, and specific language in House Bill 1543 on extensions and exemptions. Jeff will go over the results of the survey that was shared a few weeks ago. We received new entries. And we'll take a short break, and then we'll dive right into the proposed rules. So when Luke presents that information, we'll pause for questions and comments. Jeff will give an opportunity for you to speak if you want to speak, or you could put your comments in the chat or questions in the Q&A. We just hope today that you feel informed enough to make comments, stay engaged, and continue to be part of the process. So this is the rulemaking staff. Our entire team is dedicated to providing timely, actionable, and clear information about the Clean Buildings Performance Standard, and we're here to help you guide through the rulemaking process. So we have another poll questions. Tell us, have you participated in the rulemaking? I might have skipped another poll. Let's see. There we go. Thank you. Actually, this is what part of the state are you representing? So we try our best to engage with everyone in all parts of the state, and I hope we succeed in that. If not, Jeff, here you go. Thanks, Jeff. And then share the results. Now I'd like to know if you've participated in past rulemaking workshops. So the Clean Buildings laws are referred in RCW 1927 to 27A 210 to 1927A 260. You know, when the House Bill 1543 was passed, it officially amended that RCW. The Clean Buildings Performance Standard includes ASHRAE Standard 100 with the amendment of WAC 19450. Terms like RCW and WACs, they're acronyms that they sound technical, but they're very important for you to understand how government works, how laws are enforced, and how you, the public, shape the results that affect how building owners comply with the Clean Buildings Performance Standard. So when we talk about RCW, just think of the what. It essentially explains what the law must say or must not say, must or must not happen. And, you know, House Bill 1543, when it passed, it became an RCW. The rules that we're changing is in the WAC, it's the how to follow the law, and explains how the government enforces it. So let's go back to that poll. So if you could share results. It looks like there's quite a bit of few first timers, so that's great. You know, whether it's your first time or we're old friends, we're glad you're here. So this slide outlines the legislative and rulemaking activities over the past 5 years. Beginning in 2019, when the legislature passed House Bill 1257, up until today. I've been part of the rulemaking session for the I've been pretty much part of all of the rulemaking sessions for the Clean Buildings Performance Standard. And, there's a saying, you don't realize how far you've come until you've looked back. And it's been, if you've been with us from the beginning, we thank you for your continued engagement. For those who are new, we welcome you to be part of the conversation. Bring to the table your valued perspective, experience, and expertise as we write the rules for the Clean Buildings Performance Standard. So now I'm going to go through the rulemaking process. The rulemaking process is written in the Administrative Procedures Act. It begins with filing the CR 101 to indicate that we'd like to get the process of amending our rules started. Jeff, if you could put the CR 101 in the chat. For this rulemaking cycle, we'll be hosting about 3 or 4 workshops. During that time, we'll also be drafting what's called the Environmental Justice Assessment. I'll explain that further in the next slide. After a series of rulemaking workshop, the Clean Buildings team will enter into the next phase, finalizing the draft rules. Our team will file these draft rules with the CR 102 form, which can also include the Small Business Economic Impact Statement. The CR 102 starts the formal public comment period, which usually takes about 30 days and concludes with a public hearing. The public hearing after the CR 102 is filed is to get feedback, more feedback, hear your concerns and suggestions, and learn about any unintended consequences that might result in the rules. After viewing the comments and making much needed changes, the agency adopts final version of the rule. This is filed with our CR 103, and the rules are adopted 30 days after filing the CR 101. So once adopted, the rules become part of the Washington Administrative Code. Just to give you more information about the Environmental Justice Assessment. So in 2021, the HEAL Act was passed. It's to promote the reduction of environmental and health disparities in Washington in order to improve the health in all of Washington residents. Required by the HEAL Act statute, environmental justice assessments are an assessment for agencies to determine the potential impact of our agency's activities on overburdened communities, vulnerable population, tribes from all categories, And this, what we're doing here, is what's called a significant agency action. So since this rulemaking is a significant agency action, the EJA is required in order to involve the people, the communities most impacted by environmental harm in decision-making about the rulemaking. So there are 2 stages for the EJA process. Commerce is currently working on completing that draft, which will be posted for public comments on the OFM dashboard, our Clean Buildings website, and communicated to you and those who registered for these workshops. Once the comment period ends, likely in October, Commerce will integrate the input and findings from the community engagement and repost the final EJA on the OFM dashboard as completed EJA. Commerce will post this draft for public comments once you've approved it and notify all parties. We'll accept all public comments for the duration of the public comment period, which will include 2 dedicated meetings in the fall, and then a fall tribal briefing for tribes specifically, and a HEAL community involvement session for all impacted communities and interested parties. After those final meetings, Commerce will produce the final EJA incorporating all feedbacks received. So this slide displays the rulemaking timeline for House Bill 1543. The dates are subject to change. Today is our first workshop, and our next one is on July 23. We hope to conclude the entire process by December of this year. So this slide depicts the cycle of public comment during the workshop phase. After every workshop, draft rules will be emailed to registrants. They'll be available on the website as soon as possible. We will give you 2 weeks of comments, about 2 weeks to comment on the draft rule. We'll summarize your feedback in the subsequent workshop where this process kind of repeats itself. So we ask that participant in our workshops be respectful and use the Q&A field or comment forum to provide feedback. Our goal is for these rules to be a reflection of our work together, and our rules will only benefit from those workshops being inclusive and participatory. So we just ask everyone to be respectful and just have good manners. I turn it over to Luke.
Thank you, Annalyn. Good morning, everybody. Luke Howard, I'm the technical lead for the Clean Buildings Performance Standard team here at Commerce. I am going to turn my camera off. I'm having some blips in my connection, so hopefully those problems don't persist, and hopefully without camera off, I won't have so many issues. All right, so House Bill 1543. I've got a few slides here just kind of highlighting some of the provisions within. House Bill 1543 really grew out of the Clean Buildings Work Group that was enacted by the governor a couple years ago. So that work group worked in 2024 to kind of talk about clean buildings compliance. And there's three components of the bill that came out of that work group. So authority to create and adopt alternate compliance pathways, and the ability to grant timeline extensions and increase the number of exemptions allowed within the standard. Next slide, please. So what the intentions of this rulemaking is to codify rules for implementing those extensions and new exemptions prior to the first compliance date. So really our big focus here is these extension and exemption rulemaking. We want to make sure that building owners have the opportunity to apply for extensions if it's applicable to their building prior to the compliance dates, which come up in 2026, June of 2026 for the largest buildings. So the buildings 220,000 square feet and greater. We're also going to be codifying rules for alternative compliance pathways. And there's going to be some cleanup in the currently published rules in order to improve clarity. We're not going to be talking much about those rule changes in this session today or alternative compliance pathways. That'll be in future workshops. Today, we're focusing on the extensions and exemptions. Next slide, please. So, scope of rulemaking for today, or for this session of rulemaking. So the rules we'll be doing this year: extensions, rules, documents, and timelines. Exemptions, we'll be talking about the rules and the documents required for exemptions. As spoken of before, alternative compliance pathways will be in a future workshop. And we'll talk about those alternative performance metrics as well. I do want to note that we will not be talking about some specific alternative pathways, such as a greenhouse gas emissions pathway. That's something that we'll explore in future rulemaking. Next slide. So, as noted before, we are going to be making other necessary rule changes for consistency and alignment as part of this rulemaking. So amendments to existing structure and language in the Clean Building Performance Standard for clarity. We're not going to be updating the existing normalization factors. Hoping that you guys didn't miss much of that. I got a notification that my internet is unstable. We're not going to be creating rules for incentive programs and not updating the reference standard 100 2018 to any newer version of standard 100. Next slide. Okay, so next couple slides just kind of highlight where in House Bill 1543 the charging language is that allows us the authority to create exemptions, new exemptions. This document, House Bill 1543, is available on our website. We have a slide here at the end of the presentation today that will kind of show you where that lives on our webpage. So if you want to access the actual House Bill 1543 document, you can find it on our webpage. Next slide. Okay, so this specific language here from House Bill 1543 provides more clarity and expands the definition of how multiple exemption categories can be aggregated. I'll speak more of this in detail when we go over the proposed rules in a few minutes. Additionally, information we're going to be covering today in the proposed rules is the expanded definitions for exemption allowance for K-12 schools, public hospitals, historic buildings, buildings that may have significant losses in assessed value since COVID-19 pandemic and other extenuating circumstances. Next slide. So another big provision of this legislation is allowing for extensions. We'll review those proposed rules today. Next slide. Jeff, hand it over to you to talk about survey results.
All right. Thank you, Luke. Appreciate that. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. My name is Jeff Rasmussen, Outreach and Education Program Manager at the Clean Buildings team. On June 2nd, Commerce opened up a survey seeking suggestions for rulemaking, specifically surrounding alternative compliance pathways, extensions, and exemptions. This morning, I wanted to just highlight some of the takeaways that we received from the submitted responses. In total, we received 67 survey responses representing many different counties within Washington state, as well as respondents from California, Colorado, and Oregon. Respondents represented a variety of different building scenarios, such as Tier 1, Tier 2, district energy systems, and exempt buildings. And the images that you see here on your screen reflect where those responses primarily came or responded from, and the types of buildings that they were representing. If we go to the next slide, who doesn't like a good word cloud here? Respondents also represent a variety of different roles and industries, everything from building owners, facilities, personnel, project managers, and many other variety of industries. And again, you can see here on the screen where folks were coming from. Prominently featured in our survey were schools, real estate representatives, and energy consultants. One of the questions that we asked in the survey in regards to extensions asked participants for their opinions about extensions specifically for a couple different building scenarios. In the case that we have here, regarding supply chains, 78% of respondents agree or strongly agree with granting extensions to buildings whose compliance is impacted by supply chain challenges. If we compare that to on the next screen here, where workforce shortages yielded similar findings, 2/3 of the responses support allowing compliance extensions in the case of workforce shortage. As we move on with some of the questions that were in the survey, this one shows that it seems that respondents favor extensions in the case of building ownership changes. However, 1 in 3 respondents strongly agree with this allowance. And then when we asked about circumstances that may justify a compliance extension, respondents commonly supported additional extensions for buildings working towards compliance, experiencing financial hardship, or conditions beyond the building owner's control. Responses received after the June 18th informational session actually point even more strongly towards the top 3 extensions that you see here on your screen. Next, I wanted to document the suggested extension circumstances, or to document the suggested extension circumstances. Respondents suggested documents such as financial reports, bid proposals, or written plans, attestations regarding compliance. Many respondents actually agreed that some documentation should be provided, but many also responded multiple different document types should also be responded. And you can see some of those suggestions again highlighted here in the image. Now, fairness and transparency is important to commerce, and we want to acknowledge that we take the following suggestions into consideration when we begin draft rulemaking. A number of respondents pointed out that providing extensions based on factors like private or public buildings or the industry may not necessarily be the most fair. However, you do see here on the screen some that did rate favorably. And when it comes to about the question of possible benchmarks or milestones in order to receive an extension, respondents favor demonstration of benchmarking, compliance progress, or an implemented O&M as an option or as a milestone for receiving an extension. And lastly, again, Commerce receives suggestions from additional exemptions, including nonprofits and healthcare buildings, additional economic situations, as well as many other survey responses that sought to expand the existing exemption of financial hardship. We want to acknowledge that some of the survey responses may not have made it into the images or the slides that we provided. However, each suggestion was reviewed with consideration by our commerce team, and it included suggestions to change targets or building types were reviewed and considered as well. With that, I will turn it back over to Anna Lynn.
Thanks, Jeff. It is 10:28. Let's take just a few minute break because we're going to dive right into the proposed language and we're going to need your focus. So if you want to take till 10:35, that'll be great. Do we want to pause the recording there, Jeff? Thank you, everyone, and welcome back. So Luke is going to go over the proposed rules. If you read from the poll, there's quite a few that's new. So I'm just going to go over how this proposed rules is going to look like. We're going to put a link in the chat so that you can follow along with your document, and then Luke's going to go over that. Actually, I have another poll. I'm curious to how many buildings you represent. Can you put that poll up? Thanks. We're going to get smoother with these polls, I promise. I know there's some that just represent their own business. Others are energy consultants that have huge portfolios. Higher ed usually has, hundreds of buildings connected to them. So curious to see what's out there. Interesting. It looks like what's in the lead are building owners or those who represent between 11 and 50 buildings. Sounds great to see. Okay, well, that's just a quick poll. Let's go ahead and end that and share the results. Thank you so much, Jeff. Now back to the proposed language. Hopefully everyone's back from that quick break. So Jeff, if you could put in the chat, if you haven't already, put the link to the proposed language. With that link, you can click on it. It will take you to a Box document. You can view it just on Box, or you can download it. You do not have to create an account on Box to download it. It may just be in your download folder. Hopefully you have no issues with that. If you do encounter that, let us know and we'll email it to you if that makes it easier to access. When you download it, it'll come up as a Word version. In the black font, you'll see that's the original text from ASHRAE Standard 100. In blue font, it represents Washington amendments. That's already in WAC 19450. And then in the red fonts, these are the track changes showing draft of additions, and there's some that's crossed out for deletions. Track changes is different depending on your settings. Sometimes you'll see it in orange or green. But for the purpose of this presentation, Luke will show it in red fonts. And then comments identify just amendment justification or source reference. When you see this, you'll see on page 1, there's just further instruction. There's a link to our comment form, and you will be able to see other people's comments live. There's going to be a dashboard link as well on that page 1. All these links will be available on our website, and I'm going to show you where that is shortly. And then I am going to turn it over to Luke. Luke, are you ready to share the proposed language? He'll be sharing his screen.
I am ready. Right. Okay, I'd like someone to comment whether they can see the text well enough or if I should enlarge this.
Maybe just enlarge it just a little bit, Luke, if that's okay.
Better?
That's better. My face is at the screen now. It's not so much.
So, first of all, for those of you that have clicked on the link to this file, maybe easier for you just to follow along with my screen here than to have your own open. Again, I just want folks to know that you can comment on all these changes. We will be, as Anlin stated earlier, we will be receiving comments for the next 2 weeks on this workshop. We will accept comments on this workshop after this next 2 weeks, but those comments will not necessarily be included in summary in our next workshop because we wouldn't have time to include those in the presentation, but we will receive and accept comments throughout the rulemaking process. Though I noted earlier that we're really not focusing on cleanup or amendments to existing language unrelated to extensions, exemptions, and alternative compliance pathways. In today's workshop, there may be a couple, such as this first one here, that we have included in today's presentation, but for the most part, we will be focused on cleanup today. But I did want to note that this first change is just a change to tweaking the language that we felt was appropriate to allow in rule submittal of early compliance. So the energy use data used in submission of compliance documentation can actual submittal of compliance documentation. So if you're submitting for early compliance, just keep in mind that the energy data needs to be from the previous 2 years to that compliance submittal date, and not as originally stated, the compliance deadline outlined in section Z 3.2, which you can see down here, a little lower. Okay, I'm starting with Annex Z. Annex Z is the reporting requirements for Tier 1 buildings. It's a little more substantive than Annex Y, which is the reporting requirements for Tier 2. Some of the extension and exemption changes that we're proposing are relevant to Tier 1 buildings. Some of them are relevant to both Tier 1 and Tier 2. So we'll start with Section Z here, and we'll go up to the Tier 2 requirements once we've completed that. Most of what's in Annex Y is a repeat of what you're seeing here in Annex Z. So here we have extensions covered in as a new section that's exceptions to the schedule outlined in 7.3.2. So any extensions granted will give a 2-year compliance date extension based on the original compliance dates of 26, 27, and 28, depending on the size of the building. So building owners would need to submit an extension application to Commerce no sooner than 6 months prior to that compliance date and up to 6 months after the applicable compliance date. So that application will include documentation supporting the reasons for the extension. We're going to cover the documentation requirements for extensions and for exemptions in the future workshop. So next workshop. They were just focusing on the actual requirements.
Hey, Luke, before you continue, I'm just curious, how did we come up with that timeline of 2 years?
2 years.
No sooner than 6 months prior. These are
Yeah,
specific
so
timelines.
2 years was part of the legislation, and I'm going to cover a little bit more here about extensions and where the renewal is applicable. So with this legislation, we're allowed to give an extension of 2 years and 1 renewal. So a total of 4 years is possible for extensions, rather than a whole compliance cycle. That wouldn't really be an extension. It would just be an allowance to basically forgo the first compliance cycle. So that's how that 2 year and 2 year, so total of 4-year extension was determined. Submitting the application 6 months prior gives Commerce the ability to approve these extensions prior to the compliance date. 6 months after gives Commerce the ability to grant an extension even after the compliance date is passed, as long as it's within the 6 months post the compliance date. And that provision, I believe, was written into legislation to allow those that really had some issues. Maybe they felt they could meet the compliance date, but they couldn't. So it helps them avoid penalty. So the thinking is, if a building owner does not submit an application for extension or for compliance or exemption prior to the compliance date, Commerce would be sending out a notice of violation. Once that notice is received by the building owner, it gives them an opportunity to correct the violation, use an extension as part of that process. Okay, so jumping into the criteria, there are several criteria. You must meet at least one of them. So there is a beyond the control. Building owner experiences conditions beyond their control that effects of which could not have been avoided by exercising reasonable diligence, which substantially interfere with compliance efforts or schedule, including natural disasters, goods and services shortages. So that services could be, maybe there was a shortage in workforce, or goods were not available in the timeline needed. Price changes which affect the energy efficiency measure cost effectiveness. Now this provision is available for those pursuing the investment criteria. The investment criteria requires the implementation of cost-effective energy efficiency measures. That could change over time. So it may be that there's a delay because of that change in cost effectiveness of EEMs. But again, this is available for the investment criteria pathway. EEM, or the energy efficiency measure implementation, is completed, but there hasn't been enough time to collect at least 12 months of data post-implementation to measure and verify that the energy use intensity target was met, or the energy savings required through the investment criteria were met. Change of ownership, this one's pretty straightforward. Building owner purchases a building within 12 months prior to the compliance date. Financial restrictions, so building owner has financial restrictions requiring additional time to demonstrate compliance. So that could include financial hardship in accordance with existing exemptions affecting cash flow. Some folks may ask the question, well, why wouldn't I just apply for a blanket exemption from this cycle, which is the provisions of exemption. I may have been paused there for a second, but there may be instances where a building owner could be eligible for a full extension through financial hardship, but they prefer to just extend their timeline so that they can meet compliance at a more reasonable time frame concerning their cash flow. Existing capital improvement plan has a schedule to meet the EUIT or the investment criteria, the standard by the extension deadline. So if you can show us that you're making efforts to meet the standard, but you just need a little more time, and that's outlined in a capital improvement plan that shows that you can meet compliance by the end of the extension date, that's a condition that would be acceptable. So any buildings that have some new construction, that or a valid demolition permit for part of their building, that's affecting their ability to comply with the standard. Let's say they're adding square footage, so their energy use intensity pre-addition is not representative of the building post during a compliance cycle. In addition, or an extension can be applied there. We do have some thresholds for how much of the building is affected by the construction. So we place that at 25% rather than just allowing it even for maybe 100 square foot addition, for example. We also have this, so if none of these conditions above really apply to your project, but you still would like to have an extension, we have introduced this proposal for what we're calling compliance light. So the building owner complies with the benchmarking, EMP, and O&M program requirements of the standard, but they need a little more time to meet the building performance metric. Then they can apply for an extension to do so. And they would have to show that they've benchmarked the building and have implemented that energy management plan and the operations and maintenance program. We've also put in a provision here for other conditions. So for future rulemaking, we wanted to make sure that it was clear that it is possible for Commerce to increase the conditions for extension, but we must do it by rule. So that would be through another rulemaking session.
Hey, Luke, just going back, can you explain what connected building level means?
Okay, so one of the provisions of compliance light is to benchmark the building. Now, for most buildings, they'll be able to create an energy use intensity through Portfolio Manager in order to enable benchmarking. However, some buildings might not be able to measure energy use intensity for that covered building. There is a definition within the standard called connected buildings. That's where a building is connected, covered building is connected to other covered buildings or non-covered buildings through a single meter. So without installation of sub-meters at the building level would be impossible to create an energy use intensity for a covered building. In that case, we would require that benchmarking to be performed at that connected building level, even if it's including buildings that are not covered. Now, keep in mind, this is just benchmarking. With compliance light, you do not need to meet the performance metric at that connected building level. However, there are provisions within the standard that allow one to meet the energy use intensity target through the connected building level as well.
So what's the difference between compliance light and conditional compliance?
So compliance light, conditional compliance of the standard, which is part of the existing rules, allows one an extended time to demonstrate full compliance with the standard through measure and verification of either the energy use intensity target is met or the provisions of the investment criteria. However, with conditional compliance, all energy efficiency measures must be implemented by the compliance state. With compliance light, those energy efficiency measures required by the standard do not need to be installed by the compliance state. They can take that extension for 2 years and have that extra time to implement those required energy efficiency measures.
Great, thanks, Luke.
So I wanted to highlight this section below. It says an extension granted pursuant to the subsection is valid for 2 years. So that's your initial extension. When the extension expires, building owners must either submit application to the HGA for a one-time extension renewal, for exemption, or for compliance through the investment criteria or the energy use intensity target. Or if other alternative compliance pathways are codified through this rulemaking process, there may be other compliance pathways.
You know,
So,
compliance light is a popular topic. Question on that. Are there penalties for compliance light?
So the intent here with compliance light is you get the extension without having to meet the performance metric for that 2-year period, and no penalties would be assessed. And if you get a renewal, then you could extend that process for another 2 years.
And you know how we're thinking about this, if to apply, we would have to apply for extension. So since compliance light is one of them, you would have to apply for that compliance light extension, correct?
Right. So
Right.
again, to qualify for the extension renewal for Tier 1 buildings, you would need to do compliance light pathway, which benchmarking, EMP, and O&M program. So
Do
we
we-
feel like it's reasonable to expect folks that want a extension renewal to have had the time to do their benchmarking, EMP, and O&M program.
would they have to justify why they're doing compliance light, or they'll just apply for an extension and apply for compliance light?
No, at that point, they would just kind of be applying for extension through compliance light. So we would not need the justification for that. Assuming they received a primary extension in the first place through one of the other provisions.
Right. Thanks. So just going back to that statement that section about extension granted pursuant to this section is valid for 2 years. So is the maximum total allowable? Is it 4 years? Because you could renew it?
Yep, maximum total would be 4 years if a renewal is accepted.
Okay. Okay. So I'm trying to think about this. So let's say my building is greater than 226. No, I mean, sorry, it's greater than 200,000 square feet. So my deadline is 2026. So I apply for an extension. You say, here's your extension. You're extended to 2026.
2028.
2028. And then I apply for another one, right? That takes me to 2030, right? But then compliance is a 5-year cycle. So will I still be required to comply in 2031?
Yeah, it doesn't dismiss your requirement to submit compliance documents again by 2031. So that's always going to be a 5-year cycle. So assuming you've met the standard by after 2 renewals, in this case 2030, you should have the majority of the work done for re-compliance in 2031. However, I just want to mention that targets are likely to be lower by 2031. So you'll want to keep an eye out on the changing targets. Commerce is charged to review the targets in 2029. So theoretically, by 2030, you'll know what the new targets are.
There's a question on extension time for E&P and O&M submittal. Would other conditions cover if O&M program might be financial hardship or beyond their control? Sorry,
So
I'm reading two
if
different
I'm
ones.
understanding the question well enough, if you have a financial restriction that makes you eligible for extension through item C here, you would be granted an extension without having to implement the E&P and the O&M or benchmarking. Basically, you get an extension without having to show that you've done any work towards compliance yet. However, if you are going through the compliance light because you don't qualify for any of these other provisions listed above, A through D, you would need to have the E&P and O&M program implemented at time of application.
So Ian asked, like, take the example of that building greater than 220,000, compliance date of 2026. So the building data is due sooner. It sounds like you can't ask for extension at time of submittal of E&P and O&M, but have to wait 6 months. So what's the compliance date cited? So you might have to clarify or expand on that, Ian.
Yeah, I apologize, Ian. I'm not totally following the question.
Same. Jeff, you want to give Ian an opportunity to?
Yeah,
I just typed in the answer to Ian. I believe he's asking for the data due sooner, but nothing needs to be submitted before his example of the 220. He had the tier 1 greater than 220 compliance date is June 1st of 2026. And the data that's due prior to that isn't submitted to us. It's just the benchmarking for the 12 consecutive months prior to that and the O&M program that needs to be implemented 12 months prior, but that doesn't need to be submitted to us. So if you're asking for an extension for that example, 220 at June 1, it would be 6 months prior or 6 months after, which would be December 1st, 2025 to December 1st, 2026. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Judy. Appreciate you clarifying. And just before we move on, just
I don't know if you can hear me.
sorry, go ahead, Ian.
That was exactly it. Thank you, Judy.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Thanks. Zach asked, where's the document that tasked Commerce with reviewing EUI targets in 2019? It's actually not in the WAC, or this document that you're seeing right now. It's in the RCW. And then I'll put the RCW link in the chat to that specific language so that you could review that. But so go ahead, Luke.
Lynn and Judy. Okay. So we talked about the extensions now for tier 1 buildings. Let's jump into the new language or proposed language for exemptions for tier 1 buildings. So there has been some added language to allow, it kind of creates some clarity. You know, previously you could kind of, for many of the extension, it was fairly clear that they were additive. So if you had one exemption that affected a certain amount of square foot of the building and another that part of the building, if that additive
Sorry, Luke, you cut out briefly. Can you repeat that sentence?
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, so if you have various conditions in the building or building activities or spaces in the building that meet these exemptions outlined in A through E, which we'll go through below, you can add those gross floor areas together in order to take advantage of kind of an aggregate exemption status using various different exemptions. That would apply to these exemptions A through E. As long as it incorporates 50% or more of the building, then you would be eligible for exemption. So I'm not going to highlight anything but the changes in the language here for the previous exemptions. They stay the same. I did want to note that we have struck through this language that would allow or would require buildings that may be exempt from tier 1, but they still have an aggregate square footage. Again, if you've seen this language up here, it just requires 50% of the building square footage to be exempt. I mean, you could have a 500,000 square foot building with 300,000 square foot of exempt space, but you still have more than 50,000 square feet of non-exempt space. With the new provisions of this 50% threshold for all exemptions, we have struck through our previous rules that would require those buildings that still had non-exempt space to meet the tier 2 requirements of the standard. So now those exemptions would apply for that compliance cycle for the whole of the building, as long as 50% of the building complied with these exemption requirements. We've added some language for clarification, and this is language from the legislation that provides clarification for manufacturing and industrial buildings and what space use can be added into that exempt space. So it's not just the for manufacturing and industrial, it's not just the square footage designated by the building department or the fire marshal as high hazard group H or factory group F. It also includes the non-exempt spaces that directly support that manufacturer industrial processes. So that could include break rooms, maybe an office that supports that manufacturing. But I do want to point out it does not include, let's say you have a adjoining tenant that's not associated with that manufacturing or industrial process, does not include their spaces. So an example is we have definitions in table 7-4 for all building activity types that have targets. For example, a hospital. A hospital definition says, the hospital billing activity type includes, your surgery, your medical exam rooms, your laboratories, and stuff that's obviously associated with the actual healthcare. But it also states that you can include things such as hotels attached to that building, cafeterias, restaurants in that building. So these are all activities that directly support that hospital building activity type. So we've added this language in here to help clarify and make sure it was understood that those spaces that directly support but aren't necessarily identified through the building codes as high hazard group H or factor group F can be included in that aggregate square footage. We've added a few titles to some of these exemptions where they didn't exist before, just for clarity. And we have,
Hey,
go ahead.
Luke, we got a
Mhm.
question from Teddy. Jeff, can you unmute Teddy?
There we go.
Sorry, that was a miss. I did not mean to raise my hand.
That's okay.
I can't work my Q and A apparently.
No problem.
Okay. So you'll notice here there's a specific K-12 school exemption that's new. And ultimately, this really just clarifies that what it takes to prove that the K-12 school may have a financial hardship. So, for example, if bond or levy fails, essentially they can't secure the money to fund compliance with the standard, then that is a valid financial hardship exemption. It wasn't fully clear in rule prior to now. Hopefully that's helpful for folks. And there's also some specific exemption for hospitals. It's got to be a public hospital in a public hospital district that lacks the debt capacity to cover the cost of compliance. We've also added through legislation national security, so buildings for which meeting the standard would impair national security interests. We will be kind of revisiting the actual documentation process through Form H for exemptions and provide more clarity for what it would take to document that there are national security interests, for example, or that schools don't have the debt capacity or hospitals. So that so we've also
Sorry, Luke,
Yep.
you cut out.
oh sorry.
Can you go back to your last?
So what I wanted to note that is in the future workshop, we'll talk about what that documentation process looks like or what are acceptable documents for demonstrating a debt capacity issue for schools or hospitals or maybe national security interests.
Great.
So more to
Great.
come on that.
Yeah. Before you go down further, down this, going back to the question for manufacturing, can we go back to that real quick?
Sure.
Brian asked, am I to understand that campuses that are for manufacturing, high hazard occupancy code that have spaces that are considered tier 2 buildings will be exempt? If you
No, so this, let's say you have a building that's a tier 1 building. Let's say it's 500,000 square feet. And it meets the provisions of the tier 1 exemptions where 50% or more of the building is exempt through these exemptions listed in A through D or E. They, with the previous language here that struck out, let's say they still had, even though they met the provisions of the 50% being exempt, they may still have 200,000 square feet of space that's not exempt. previous rules that struck out here would require them to meet that 200,000 square foot portion of the building would need to meet the provisions of our tier 2 requirements. We have struck that out because of the new language that was in the House Bill 1543 legislation. So they would just be exempt for that cycle from compliance with the standard. If, let's say, you have a manufacturing or high hazard group H building on a campus that may have other buildings, either tier 1 or tier 2, they would need to comply individually. If that compliance may be of exemption, because there might be other buildings on that campus that are exempt, but there may be buildings on that campus that are not.
Hopefully that answers it for you, Brian. Brian, can I get a thumbs up? I don't know if you can react, if that clarifies things for you. If not, oh, great, thank you. You know, just real quick before you go down further, Beth asks the term public health district. Many people may not be familiar with that. Do we have a definition for that?
You know, that's not a bad idea. Perhaps we can create a definition for the public health hospital district.
Thanks,
could-
Beth.
Yeah, I couldn't rattle it off on my top of my head, but
Yeah, I think that was also in the original House Bill 1543 language, correct? Or is that something that we,
I think this is straight from the legislation.
yeah, we will. Thanks for pointing that out and bringing that to our attention. And that's the magic of rulemaking, getting your feedback and eyes on this, because we can't think of everything, right? So the topic of K-12 is actually a pretty popular question here. Will the failure of a K-12 bond or levy need to be in some way related to the failure to meet EUI? For example, if a levy for a building, a new school fails, should that allow the district to receive the exemption?
So if they meet the energy use intensity target, it would not apply. But if they can't meet compliance through anything but exemption because they don't have the funding or the debt capacity to do so, then that's when this would apply. Perhaps we need to provide more clarity in a rule so that's understood. It may be that the debt capacity is not large enough to even implement the energy management plan or the operations and maintenance program or benchmarking. Great,
thanks. So one of the audience members works for a public K-12 school district, and it appears they might meet that financial hardship exemption requirement. When will the application process be open for them to start this exemption or extension process?
So as noted up above, the application would be 6 months, open up 6 months prior to the compliance date, and that was legislatively mandated. So we can't change that date to be sooner.
So okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So we'll have to produce some guidance documents that clearly educates the building owners of what the details of the requirements, so they can feel assured that those applications would be accepted.
Great, thank you. You know, bond measures failures, Brian notes that bond measures fail all the time, but not necessarily having anything to do with compliance with the clean buildings requirement. So does it matter what the bond measure that failed is for? And so you can answer that. There's a second part of this question.
We would expect the bond measure to at least partially be towards clean buildings performance compliance.
And then the second is much or all of the changes to existing buildings are cost neutral in that the compliance measures reduces the operating costs for the building and pay for themselves. Are districts exempt for doing any kind of efficiency improvements, even when those expenses are covered through operations?
It would not be a debt capacity issue.
Okay, thanks, Luke. And then sticking with the K-12 theme, while the K-12 exemption is helpful for capital construction, that does not address the EMP costs. So for school, capital funds construction and modernized buildings are general funds cover operations and maintenance. The EMP costs are funded by the general fund. So K-12 could have a financial hardship due to the inability to get a capital bond or levy and or have a financial hardship with their general fund. They just suggest more scrutiny of this issue and more applicable to state laws. So thank you so much for that, Steve. I wasn't familiar with that, but we'll take that into consideration.
Okay, so the legislation also gave us an ability to create a pathway towards the exemption that didn't exempt certain situations from full exemption of compliance requirements. It would still require the benchmarking and implementation of the energy management plan and operations and maintenance program in accordance with the standard. So this is what we're calling compliance light. So it's everything but the performance metric. It's essentially the tier 2 requirements for tier 1 buildings. And that would be for buildings, historic buildings, if they are on the National Register of Historic Places or the Washington State Heritage Register or local municipality registers of historic places, and they can choose to apply for compliance light, and that would be their acceptable compliance for that cycle, but they would need to submit benchmarking EMP and O&M program implementation documentation. That would also include buildings with significant loss in assessed value. So this was written in the legislation as due to COVID-19. We just put the date here of March 2020 because that covers the period where COVID-19 was affecting building occupancy and basic day-to-day life, and it could have affected the value of the building.
Look, I'm kind of curious, what's the difference between significant loss in assessed value and financial hardship? Or heavy and immediate financial need?
Yeah, so as you know, there's we have financial hardship as well. Now, if you have as a building owner, you have heavy and financial need, you cannot secure a loan from a bank for any of your properties. That would be documentation for full exemption. But let's say you just have one building that has significant losses in assessed value, so there's not enough equity in the building to get a loan based on that building value. But the business itself is financially solvent and could secure a loan from a bank based on the value of the business itself and not the building individually. So this allows a pathway for those that may have the resources as a business to meet compliance with the standard, but that building itself is struggling to it doesn't have the value that they can draw a loan directly from the equity in the building.
Great, thank you.
And so this is kind of, again, compliance light. We would expect investment in benchmarking, the E&P and the O&M in these situations. So lastly here, I've just highlighted that in future rulemaking, we could expand this list if desirable. That covers the tier 1 proposals.
Hey, Luke,
Mhm.
speaking of future outlook, so Jordan asked if we're trying, if they're trying to look down the road after 2031, how can they message their leadership the effectiveness of capital project to meet existing compliance when we don't know where the requirements could be in after 2031? Their preference would be to initiate and approve projects we know would satisfy the requirements kind of 10 years out. So what do you say to that?
I don't have a great answer, a very comforting answer about that. The original legislation in House Bill 1257 specifically asked that energy use intensity targets not be reevaluated until 2029. I think the intent was at that point we would have a lot of Washington State specific data that we could use to make well-informed decisions about the trajectory of the energy use intensity target reductions over time. So we are not that's going to take some studies, and we are not mandated to do that until 2029. I will note that we have secured some DOE funding that will help us to establish those new targets. We will be actually starting to use that funding hopefully in 2027 in order to get a jump on that new target setting and the trajectory that we will be expecting over the next few cycles. So unfortunately, we can't kind of project that out yet.
Thanks, Luke.
Okay,
And
so
you
I'm going to.
said that.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, you said that was tier 1. Are you covering tier 2 now?
I'm going to go up to Annex Y now and just kind of cover the provisions, the proposals that we have affecting exemptions and extensions. Again, it's replicates tier 2 or tier 1 for the most part, but there are some differences because the requirements are different. So the same charging language here that talks about early compliance. We have some changes just titling sections to make it a little easier to follow. Same language here for a application process of six months prior and up to 6 months after. So we've kind of reduced some of the the provisions that would allow for extension because 2 does not require a performance metric. So you'll see a reduced number here reflecting that. So we still have natural disasters declared by an appropriate government official, goods and services shortages causing delays. Again, that could be actual equipment, capital measures. It could be a lack of workforce to maybe do energy audits or benchmarking services, energy management planning, operations and maintenance program development, that kind of stuff. Again, we'll talk about what kind of documentation and justification will be needed for that in our next workshop. We have that change of ownership allowance, financial restrictions. So one might ask why a tier 2 building would want to, when they're eligible for a financial hardship, why would they want to just do an extension? There are a lot of building owners that are intending to meet the standard, but they need a little more time in order to do so because of cash flow. This could even be a school district or something, and it just doesn't jive with their funding mechanisms. New construction, that's the same language as we talked about for tier 1. There is no compliance light option for an extension for tier 2 buildings. Again, compliance light requires all the tier 2 requirements, so it would be meaningless as for extension. And again, for renewal, it's not as restrictive. For tier 2, you do not need to benchmark or implement the EMP and the O&M prior to getting a renewal. Again, that's the basic requirements for tier 2. Same language for the exemptions, 50% of the building square footage. It can be in combination or aggregate of multiple exemptions. Same language here regarding the manufacturing exemption and how supporting spaces can be used in that aggregate calculation. Some titles added for clarity. We have that K-12 provision. It's the same as for tier 1, as well as the hospital. Again, no compliance light for tier 2. Okay. And that is all we have for proposed language for this workshop.
Thanks, Luke. There was a suggestion using a 2.5-year extension rather than 2. So we won't leave that one awkward year before cycle begins. We like awkwardness here, Stephen, but just kidding.
Yeah, the legislation spells out the 2-year with the ability to renew for another 2-year. We can't change that in rule, but we hear you.
We do. And, we go back to what's written in House Bill 1543 and kind of what we can do. We can't make too many changes of what's written in legislation. We can just kind of provide additional rules and guidance for it.
Yeah,
So,
and I believe the intent of the 2 year was if it was 2.5 years with renewal, it would end up just being an exemption for that cycle, and the legislation wasn't wanting to go that far.
I'm gonna ask Zach's question, but if there's anyone who would like to speak, feel free to raise your hand. We have some time for other questions. So Zach asked, would a significant planned capital investment to meet the requirements of the Seattle BEPS potentially meet the criteria for the financial hardship exemption? Or is there some other option for this kind of situation? A poorly performing building plan might plan for a large investment more than 5 years in advance to comply with BEPS, BEPS net zero by 2041 to 2045 target, and it may not be practical to meet the EUIT prior to that.
Yeah, so it's possible now for the first reporting cycle, 26, 27, and 28, BEPS really doesn't apply because they don't really have a performance metric until their second cycle. I believe it's 20, 31, 32, or 33, but it's beyond, it's at our second cycle. So potentially what we would like to evaluate for a compliance pathway is compliance with Seattle BEPS. But that wouldn't be until the second cycle. But it's certainly our intention to align our standard with BEPS as much as possible and to provide some provisions for reciprocation, if you will, for the two. I know BEPS requires the operations and maintenance program and energy management plan requirements of the standard. So we'd have to figure out how, of our standard, the clean building standard. So we would have to figure out how that documentation would work. If they're relying on us for one, and we're relying them on for another. So, but that'll be investigated here in the future.
Great. I'm just gonna, if I could take over, Luke, and talk about next steps. And let me see if I can share smoothly. Great. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Next steps, we're still taking questions. We do have this scheduled to noon, but I just wanted to tell you about where you can find this information. Like I said before, we're going to email this to everyone that registered, whether you attended or not. So hopefully in the future, if you miss a workshop that you registered for and you think you're not going to have the information, it'll certainly be emailed to you. You go to our Clean Buildings homepage. There's a section called House Bill 1543 Rulemaking. If you press that plus sign, it'll expand and show all of the materials that is emailed. And to the right, you'll also find where you can subscribe to our bulletin, where you get up-to-date information and answer any questions, ask any questions. When you submit comments, I just want to mention, when you submit comments, you're submitting a comment. If you're asking a specific question, I suggest you either email us or put in a customer support ticket, because that's when you will actually receive a response. Comments, for the most part, are just comments that we're receiving, and we'll just take them into consideration, even if they come in the form of a question. So again, this is where you'll find the recording, the comment form, the proposed rules, and links to the rulemaking material. If you're unable to find these links or you're having issues with downloading, please connect with us and we'll email them to you directly. future rulemaking will also be there. Next one is July 23rd. Again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you on the 23rd. And then we'll stay for questions. If not, have a great day. Jeff, I think we can stop the recording so that it's not just silence.